Speaker tonight was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and he received a degree in physics from Holy Cross College, served 3 years as a Marine Corps officer, and began a career as an electronics engineer in 1960. In 1966, he left the engineering profession and accepted a full-time position with the John Birch Society. He has served in a variety of posts and has been the organizational chief spokesman since 1973. In June 1991, he was named the president of the John Birch Society. He is a writer, a speaker, a film and television producer, an editor, and a radio and television spokesman. I'm proud to introduce to you the president of the John Birch Society, Mr. John McManus.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to be back in Dallas. I frequently tell people when I'm traveling that I'll be back, and I'm happy to be able to make that promise come true here in Dallas. I've been here quite a few times, and always it's been a plus. It's been a plus personally, and I think, hope it's been a plus for the society. We're going to be talking mostly about the military tonight in the United Nations, and one of the problems we face in our country is that even people in the military, of course, are products of the American school situation, and it's getting increasingly obvious to many that that's not what you'd call a good scene. We had a story recently about a mother that was having trouble getting her son to go to school. And he kept telling her, you got to go to school, and he kept saying, no, I don't want to go to school. And it was back and forth. You've got to go to school. No, I don't want to go to school. Back and forth, you know. And finally, the fellow looked up and he said to his mother, he said, all right, he said, give me 2 good reasons why I have to go to school. And she said, okay, 2 good reasons. You're 45 years old and you're the principal. And you got to say to yourself, can it get that bad, right? And I heard a story, too, about a young fellow who went off to Sunday school, and he came back and he told his mother, what a lesson they gave us today. Wow, what a lesson. She says, tell me all about it. Tell me all about it. He said, he says, well, it was about the time that the Jewish people were being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh's army, and they were getting ahead, and they were doing okay, but then they're backing up against the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh's army's coming down on them, and it really wasn't looking very good for them, and they were in grave jeopardy. He says, So Moses got on his walkie-talkie, he said, and he called in the Israeli Air Force. They bombed the Egyptians, and then the Israeli Navy came aboard, across the sea, picked them up, and took them to safety. And his mother rolled her eyes. Is that what they taught you in Sunday school? And he said, well, no, Mom, but if I told you the way they told me, you wouldn't believe it. You see, the boy was skeptical about something he should have believed. And here we are in the good old US of A today, and we have all kinds of people believing things when they should be skeptical. And what we're here tonight to do is to kind of improve on the skepticism and make people a little bit more aware of some things that they really should be aware of. Now, one of the things that I think people should be skeptical about today is this constant cry that the United Nations is a bunch of bunglers, doesn't really accomplish anything. And you people who are upset about the UN and are saying, get us out, what are you worried about? Look, the United Nations, look what they bungled in Somalia, they bungled in Haiti, they're bungling in Bosnia. What are you all concerned about? Right? I dare say that some of you have heard that. Right? But ladies and gentlemen, it's not well known, but the United Nations is in the schools of America. UNESCO helps to direct the Goals 2000 program, the outcome-based education program. That's all from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The United Nations is involved in family matters. They have a declaration on the rights of the child that is before the U.S. Senate that will tell children, you don't have to obey your parents. You have rights. You know? If your parents say you have to be in at 10 o'clock at night, tell them no. Go to the UN. The United Nations has involvement in ecology movement, the environment, everything. I was in Montana just last week. I got there and a fellow handed me a newspaper clipping, a Montana newspaper. They're talking about a gold mine that somebody wanted to open over near Yellowstone. And lo and behold, there's a United Nations Commission there on World Heritage Sites telling these people in Montana that you dare not go and open up this mine. It might soil the World Heritage Site called Yellowstone National Park. Well, I don't know who designated it a World Heritage Site. You know, I don't know who designated a federal park. It should be a Wyoming state project, if anything. And so, is the United Nations here and there and everywhere? Yes. Now, I'm focusing tonight in my talk on the military and the United Nations, but a colleague of mine has written a book called Freedom on the Altar, the UN's program Crusade Against God and Family. And in his book, he talks about these matters. UNESCO, about whose children are. Are they parents' children or are they governments? And the United Nations, talking about population control and multiculturalism that's being promoted by them, and religious movements even. They have a one world religion they're promoting under the earth goddess, Gaia. Not me. All kinds of things, and his book dwells on what could be called the domestic matters, foreign policy matters. And you can see his book here. He's got the meditation room at the United Nations. Great big slab of granite there, and it's all black, and it looks white because there's a reflection on the top of it. And then there's this wall that has all these squiggles and lightning bolts and New Age type garbage. Yeah, garbage. I've been in that room, and it's about maybe 1/4 the size of this room. And get in there, and you get kind of an eerie feeling, and you come out of there and you want to take a shower and get away from it. But that's the United Nations. And anybody who thinks that the United Nations is inconsequential and a bunch of bunglers has been sold a bill of goods, just not backed up at all. Well, we're going to jump around a little bit in this talk of mine, and what I like to do in any talk, some of you have heard me speak before, is I like to lay the foundation. The John Birch Society is opposed to the United Nations. We're opposed to this, we're opposed to that, we don't like this government program. And people would get the impression that we're just a bunch of beginners, but what are we for? Let's define what we're for. What is it that stimulated Robert Welch to start the John Birch Society? He did so in 1958. In 1939, he wrote an essay talking about the country that he was born in and loved and grew to admire as he learned more about it, and how unhappy he was that it was being converted into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that had come before. And he said that in 1939. So in 1958, he formed our society, and he led off by saying, we are for Americanism. We are opposed to anything that's the opposite. Communism, socialism, Nazism, fact, all of that. And certainly opposed to big government. We're for the American system. But what is the American system? How do you define it? Well, you go back to the beginning. You go back to when it started. You go back to the marvelous Declaration of Independence. And there you find the philosophical base of this nation. And of course, later came the Constitution, and this little booklet has both. The Constitution is really the nuts and bolts that followed the philosophical foundation laid by the men who wrote the Declaration and signed it and pledged their lives and fortunes and sacred honor to keep it. What is that foundation? It's very simple. It says men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Stop right there. No nation ever began with that foundation. There is a God, and He gave us our rights, not government. Then they went on and defined the proper role of government. The very next breath, they said, to secure these rights, governments are instituted. And there you have the whole American system. There is a God. He gave us our rights. We use our rights and our powers as people to form a government. For what purpose? To protect those rights, and nothing more. Not to redistribute the wealth, not to change people's lives, not to do this, not to do that. Protect their God-given rights, and that's all. Fantastic. Every time I talk about it, I get that chill up the spine. That's Americanism, and you can't even teach that in the government schools that we're all forced to pay for, because you can't teach about God's existence. Right? How about that? Isn't that something? And people say, what are you concerned about, you Birchers? There's something to be concerned about. Well, the Declaration of Independence was promulgated, and the British said, no, you don't. Right? So we had a little war, didn't we? The war for independence. And we won. We sent the British back across the ocean. And I'm delighted that that happened, and part of the reason is I have a little bit of Irish heritage, and that enters into it. We fought the war under the Continental Congress, then the Articles of Confederation, and after the war was won, they got together in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation and threw them away and said, no, we're going to start all over again, and they built a whole new governmental system called the Constitution of the United States of America. And here it is. There it is, the whole thing. Look how many pages. Which means you know it couldn't have been written by government today. Now, whom does it limit? Does it limit you and me? You know, no, it doesn't. It limits government, it doesn't. Strictly defined powers are given, checks and balances, diffusion of powers, separation of powers, everything proper to get government in place, and then to limit it to just those proper powers, which can be summarized as the protection of the lives and property of the people of this country. That's all. So, the Constitution was written, and then it was sent to the states for ratification, and the states, one after another, began to ratify it. You go back east to little Delaware, it's about that small compared to where I am this night here in Texas, right? Little Delaware. You see all the number plates on the cars. It says the first state. Where did they get off calling themselves the first state? There were 13 original states, weren't there? They were the first state to ratify the Constitution. We beat Pennsylvania by 5 days, and Pennsylvania's never forgiven them. So the Constitution was ratified. But along the ratification process, there were people who stood up and said, you know, we think it would be better if we had added to this a statement of what we believe our rights to be. In other words, let's not have anybody presume this. And let's put down what we believe our rights to be. So the promise was made, all right, get the Constitution ratified, we'll add to it a Bill of Rights. And those were amazing days. The politicians kept their promise. And there was added to it the Bill of Rights. And there's the Bill of Rights, all 10 of the First Amendments right there in 2 pages. Now what are the rights they talked about? The right to welfare, education, medical care, housing. You know, you see, they made a distinction. They talked about right in the what could be called the perfect right. The perfect right is a right that if you have it, I have an obligation to give it to you and to see that it is not impaired, such as the right to speak, the right to publish, the right to practice your religion, the right to keep and bear arms, and the right to be free from search and seizure, and so forth. If you don't have that right, then it's my duty to see to it that your right is reestablished. That's a perfect right. The other things are not rights, right? They are really kind of like looting. When you talk about the right to education and housing and welfare and medicine and all those other things, they're not really rights. And therefore they weren't mentioned in the Bill of Rights. Now the important thing to remember here is that the Bill of Rights gives us no rights whatsoever. It's a totally negative document. What does it say? It says Congress can't take them away. Congress shall make no law regarding this one and that one and this one and that one and the other one. Congress shall not, shall not, shall not, shall not, shall not, all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment that says if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is magnificent. People throughout the past 200 years who have looked this over and studied it have said this is the greatest thing ever struck off by the minds of men for ruling, for leading a government. And its great wisdom is that government is limited. Well, if the Constitution were fully enforced today, the government of the United States would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. Right? Now, why do I say that? Well, let's go to just, you know, I could spend all night just talking about this, and I don't want to, but let's go to the very first sentence. We see here, after the preamble, Article 1, Section 1, Sentence 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. All right, there's 2 very important concepts right there. And the first is all. All legislative lawmaking power is vested in Congress. Now, let me see if there's any algebra students here tonight. If all legislative power is in Congress, how much of it's in the Supreme Court? Do we have any algebra students here? Sure, 0. Aren't you told, however, that a Supreme Court decision is the law of the land? It's not. It's not supposed to be. Supreme Court decision is the law of the case. It binds two parties, the plaintiff and the defendant. That's all. And also, executive decrees, bureaucracy putting long lists of regulations in the Federal Register that take on the force of law, totally illegitimate. All lawmaking power is vested in Congress. We got to get back to that. All right? Now, the next thing that I want to focus on here are the two words, herein granted. All legislative powers herein granted vested in Congress. All right? What does that mean, herein granted? It means that if it's not in these pages, it doesn't exist legitimately. Herein granted. You can search from stem to stern here, the whole Constitution of the United States, and I defy you to find foreign aid. Education, housing, welfare, medical care, agriculture, transportation, energy. And we could go on and on and on. Herein granted, it's not there. I know a lot of people who bank on the Second Amendment for the right to keep and bear arms, and I'm not sorry that the Second Amendment is there, but I think herein granted is more important. There is no mention of private ownership of firearms in the Constitution of the United States, and therefore there is no power herein granted to have federal government say anything about the private ownership of firearms. And any mandate from the federal government is totally illegitimate regarding private ownership of weapons. It is not herein granted. Now let's get back to the Constitution. All these characters in Washington, they swear an oath to it, and then they put it in the bottom drawer and they go and do whatever they please. And who do we blame for that but ourselves? If we allow it, then they will go ahead and continue to do exactly that. It's time for the American people to start thinking Constitution. And I'm very pleased to see, as I travel the country, so many more people, not just members of the Birch Society, but people all over the country, talking Constitution, reading it, understanding it, and beginning to say to those rascals that go down there and represent us, it's about time you read it. Even though you've sworn an oath to it, you should still read it, and you should still abide by it. So there's the American system. Now we have somewhat of a contrast here. We have another document that we talk about, and that's called the Charter of the United Nations. And that is to the United Nations somewhat like the Constitution is to our country, and there it is. Now, this document has a lot of very interesting things in it, but I won't focus on many, but just a couple. For instance, the United Nations is constantly called a peace organization, and I think you've heard that. Let me read to you Article 42, and then you tell me if that sounds like a peace organization. Should the Security Council consider that measures provided for in a previous article would be inadequate or have proved to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Such action may include demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the members of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a war organization. There it is. Who ever heard of a peace organization involved in that kind of stuff? War. And they're constantly talking about the need for a United Nations peace force. If you know what an oxymoron is, I've just given you one. Peace force. If it's force, it's not peace. All right, now let's move over here to Articles 52, 3, and 4, which are headed Regional Arrangements. And there we find NATO and CETO, which is now out of business. They don't name them, but they talk about the fact that it's perfectly permissible for them to form, for anybody to form a regional arrangement among other nations. And it says the Security Council shall, where appropriate, utilize such regional arrangements or agencies for enforcement action under its authority, but no enforcement action shall be taken under regional arrangements or by regional agencies without the authorization of the Security Council. Is NATO part of the United Nations, submissive to the Security Council of the United Nations? I just read that to you. Exactly. And every American who serves in NATO serves in a United Nations regional agency, and nobody has ever been given a choice. NATO is part of the UN. I listen to the television news every once in a while. About a week or two ago, I happened to catch the admiral over in Italy at the naval base there that we have, who's sending his planes into Bosnia and dropping bombs in Bosnia. His name is Leighton Smith, and Admiral Leighton Smith was just exuding his delight at being, quote, able to carry out the mandates of the Secretary General. And I thought to myself, gee, you know, the UN has a Secretary General and the NATO has a Secretary, but I don't think the United States has a Secretary General. And there he was, just delighted to be carrying out the mandates of the Secretary General. So I said to myself, I wonder if he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So I got out my little book and I looked, and lo and behold, there is Leighton Smith. Big surprise. So the United Nations is a war organization, and it has regional arrangements to help it conduct war and get involved in wars, and therefore make wars worse. Well, people say to me, well, somebody got to do something in Bosnia. I say, all right, fine. If you feel that way, go ahead and do something, but don't force me to do it. Don't force my son, my daughter, my nephew, and don't force me to open my wallet to finance your whims. Where do you get off? What should be done about that? Well, they've been fighting at it for about 400 or 500 years. Kind of stupid for us to stick our nose in it, isn't it? Yes, indeed. Well, let's go back to the UN, however. The UN, I talked about the Charter. They have the equivalent, they say, of the Bill of Rights. They have a document called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it talks about the kinds of rights that we talk about in the Bill of Rights, but it does it in a different way. For instance, is there any God at the United Nations that grants rights? The answer is absolutely not. God has never been welcome at the United Nations. And so rights don't come from God, according to the United Nations. Where do they come from? Well, they never really say, but they want to presume that they give them to you. And of course, if they give them to you, they can take them away. That's perfectly proper. So let me read to you Article 18 and see if you can catch on the way the UN operates here. It says this: everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. It doesn't say anything about where it comes from. 2 sentences later it says, freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. You see, you caught it, didn't you? Huh? And the U.S. Bill of Rights says what? Congress shall make no law. Because the right comes from God, and it transcends any power of government which is down on here, and government shall have nothing to say about it. What a difference. It's turned upside down completely. The U.S. system is God, people, governments. The UN system is government, people, and no God. Just completely upside down, and if there's any better reason to get us out of the United Nations, I don't know what it could be. And it goes on over and over again in this international covenant. 21 says, the right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law. That's exactly parallel to the Soviet Constitution under Joseph Stalin, where rights were granted by government, but the power to cancel them out of existence was contained in the granting of the right. And lo and behold, they canceled them out of existence. So, there's the UN. Now, we can't really understand the thrust of our message here tonight without understanding at least something about the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the granddaddy of the New World Order builders, an organization that goes all the way back to 1921, formed when the U.S. Senate turned thumbs down at the end of World War I to our entry into the League of Nations. And when they did, then the people who wanted a world government under the League of Nations said, fine, We'll form an organization here and we'll condition the American people to want, even clamor for, a world government. And they got funding from the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and pretty soon they took over the State Department, and pretty soon they're running their people for president. Then they took over the media, then they took over the corporations, and now they have control of our military. Most of the top admirals and generals in the Pentagon are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. I've got a whole chapter about that in my book, and it's not a very pretty picture. Superintendents at West Point and chiefs of staff of the Air Force and the Army, and 4 of the last 5 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including Colin Powell, members of this organization. Does the organization promote world government? Absolutely. And some of them will deny it and say they're just a debating society, that they don't really have any particular point of view. And yet, members of this organization, under direction and being paid by the U.S. taxpayers' money, have been pretty explicit about it over the years. I'll give you 2 examples. The first is that in 1962, the State Department produced a taxpayer-funded study entitled "A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations." Now, I don't have to explain the thrust of that particular document. There you have it. Written by CFR member Lincoln Bloomfield, who was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Originally classified secret, the document that was later unclassified, we grabbed a copy of it and we've been using it ever since. And what did he say? He said he wanted to see the UN have taxing powers, wanted to have a military force of 500,000 men. He wanted to have world authority. And then he went as far as defining the terms. Right? Don't have anybody have any distinction about this. No confusion allowed. All right? He said this: world means that the system is global with no exceptions to its fiat, universal membership required. Effectively controlled connotes a relative monopoly of physical force at the center of the system. The United Nations, he says, is not necessarily precisely the organization as it now exists. Finally, to avoid endless euphemism and evasive verbiage, the contemplated regime will occasionally be referred to unblushingly as a world government. Right? Now that's these guys saying it, not me. That's what they said. That's what they mean. Now what does a world government mean to you and to me? It means cancel the Declaration of Independence, toss the Constitution in the nearest circular file, and take us on to world tyranny. It's absolutely certain that if you put all power in any single repository, the United Nations or whatever, I guarantee you it will be used for tyranny. Power corrupts. Nationhood is a good thing, and our nation is the best. The best that's ever been conceived by the minds of men. It's worth protecting and defending, even worth defending with our lives. Now, among the many other examples I could cite to show you what this United Nations is really all about, we go to Foreign Affairs magazine in 1974. That's the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And there we see an article by a professor from Columbia University who had been in and out of the State Department and had frequently sworn an oath to the Constitution of the United States, required to do so. And I believe every time he did so, he perjured himself. Right? He wrote an article called The Hard Road to World Order. And again, this is 1974. And in the article, he talked about the problem for them of a single leap into world government is not practical, he said. We must advance piecemeal. And he actually said that what is called for is, quote, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Abject treason, in my view. Well, the man listed all kinds of things that could be taken, steps that could be taken as this end run is accomplished around national sovereignty, and one of the ones that he named was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which the Congress of the United States ratified just last year. The rest of it reads like a forecast of what's going to happen, because most of it already has happened. And that man is now our ambassador to Spain. He's again taking an oath to the Constitution. The Council on Foreign Relations also publishes its own little documents from time to time, and it has a critical issues series. This is just a cover and a couple of pages of a booklet called The United Nations Reborn, written by George L. Sherry and published, as you can see if you're close enough. It says Council on Foreign Relations here. 1990 it was published. And in here, this Professor George Sherry, a member of the CFR, says, after all, the UN Charter is the law of the land. Well, what happened to the Constitution? I thought the Constitution was the law of the land, and this is, of course, the wish being father to the thought, unless he knows something that I don't, and the ball game is already over. But I don't think the ball game is over, ladies and gentlemen. I wouldn't be bothering you. I wouldn't be asking you to spend an evening of your time if, in fact, we had no hope. We certainly do have plenty of hope. So there's a little look at the Council on Foreign Relations, where we can find the President and the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the House and practically all cabinet officers, about 15 senators, 15 congressmen. We have 3 justices of the Supreme Court. We have the leaders of all the major media, radio, television, newspapers, even the Wall Street Journal, by the way, that a lot of people think is somewhat different, and it's not. It's very internationalist at least. And we see corporate leaders and military leaders, even religious leaders, in this 3,600 members, and that's all. The 3,600 names are given in the back of my little book called The Insiders. And it's kind of like a scorecard when you go to the ball game. You need this on your television, and when someone's name comes up, you say, oh, okay, let's take a look. Oh, there he is. Right? Oh, there he is. And you can't tell the players without a scorecard. Right? I certainly recommend you pick up a copy of that. All right, now, what are they doing to us now? They've got us in Bosnia, haven't they? We've already mentioned this, and here we have our admiral saying that he's delighted in carrying out the mandates of the Security Council and the Secretary General. You know, you've actually got 4 factions over there. 2 of them are Serbian, one's Croatian, one's Muslim. You've got the Bosnian Serbs within Bosnia that is supposed to be left for the Muslims, and then you got the Serbian Serbs, and they're outside, and they're helping the Bosnian Serbs and so on, and the Croats don't like either the Serbs or the Muslims, but they occasionally go up 2 against 1, and then after that's over, then the 2 that were together will then go at each other. And ultimately, it's a religious struggle. The Croats are Catholics, the Serbians are Greek Orthodox, or Orthodox like the Greek Orthodox, and the Muslims, of course, are Islam, followers of Islam. And it's been going on for only about 400 or 500 years, and so it makes sense for us to stick our nose in it, doesn't it? It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And yet the American people get propagandized into saying somebody's got to do something. And I say, fine, if you want to do something, go ahead. And they say, you're an isolationist. And I say, no, I'm a non-interventionist. With your son and your daughter and your wallet. I'm a non-interventionist. And I think that's a good answer for anybody. If you oppose this, as I think you should, well, what I think really is happening here is that this thing is being dragged out, and it's being muddled and confused, and people are getting frustrated about it. You're going to see more and more a requirement called for a United Nations permanent standing army. Something that the United Nations has always wanted, and I think you will see much of that coming out of this situation in Bosnia. I don't want it. I think it would be very dangerous. I think certainly I would not support any Americans being assigned to it. Now we've seen bad news here. Bad news, bad news. Let's turn tails here. Let's talk about some good news. Some of you heard me on the radio today, and we were talking about a young American from Texas. A young man named Michael New, N-E-W. Michael New is stationed with an Army unit in Germany, and he's just been informed by his leaders that their unit is being transferred to Macedonia, which is just south of Bosnia. And when they get there, they're going to have to wear the blue berets and blue helmets of the United Nations. And Michael New stood up, and he looked them right in the eye, and he said, not me. He said, I swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States. I joined the United States Army. I'm perfectly willing to accept an assignment with the United States Army. I did not join the United Nations Army, and I did not swear any oath to the UN Charter. I consider that a foreign enemy. And Michael New is... Michael New is facing disciplinary action. And one of his superiors, a master sergeant, came to him and he said, "Young man, you're going to have to learn about the United Nations." And he said, "I already know about the United Nations, and that's why I'm saying what I'm saying." The situation is quite dramatic. Now, there's several features to this that are dramatic. The first is that this young man's parents have pointed out in a letter they wrote to the Chief of Staff of the United States Army and the Pentagon that an American who is assigned to the United Nations and gets in a scrape and is captured is considered a hostage. An American who is captured, gets in a scrape, and he's wearing a U.S. uniform is a prisoner of war. And there's a marked difference. They've pointed out the story of Lieutenant Colonel Higgins, who I wrote about back in 1988. This man was assigned to the United Nations in the nation of Israel. And he was told that he wasn't allowed to have a weapon and he had to wear a blue helmet. He was captured by the Hezbollah militants and he was tortured and killed, and our government did nothing. And Michael New's parents, father of whom is a John Birch Society member, right? And they pointed this out to this Chief of Staff of the Army. Well, they're trying to figure out what to do about this situation, and what are they going to do? Well, are they going to discipline Michael New? They probably will discipline him. I don't think, however, that they're going to court-martial him. Because if they court-martial him, he's got a chance to give his side of the story. And I don't think they want that. You may recall that at the end of, or during World War II, there was the story of the Admiral and the General who were at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kimmel and General Short. And they were both held accountable for supposedly not being ready when the Japs came, and they demanded to be court-martialed so that they could give their side of the story, and the authorities would never do that. They wouldn't court-martial them. And the family is still trying to clear Admiral Kimmel's name. I know grandson of Admiral Kimmel lives in South Carolina, is a friend, and they were up in Washington only a couple of months ago to protest what was going on and try to clear the name of the patriarch of that family. So I don't know that Michael New will be court-martialed, but there's a defense fund that's already been set up. Now, the other side of this thing that is so appealing to me is that there has been absolutely no news, or hardly any, I should say, about this in any of the secular press. Hasn't been on the radio, television, hasn't been in the news magazines, it hasn't been anywhere, except just a little bit here. Chicago Sun-Times ran a meet in the Washington Times. It's all I know about, right? Very small. And Michael New, in a period of Labor Day week, got 2,000 pieces of mail at his address in Germany from Americans supporting what he was doing, and most of them containing contributions for his legal defense. How did that happen? It happened because of the rise and the proliferation of what could be called the alternative media. The alternative media that was begun by a man named Robert Welch in 1958 with the John Birch Society, that has now burgeoned and spread. It's now into talk radio, the internet, fax machines, all kinds of little publications and newsletters. And the American people are getting the information not from the Council on Foreign Relations controlled media, but from alternative media. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted about that. I think you should be too. It's growing, it's becoming more impressive all the time. I was on a radio show in Florida just about 2 weeks ago, and the congressman from the district was there. His name is Joseph Scarborough. He's newly elected last fall. And when I got on the radio, he's in the studio in Florida with the host, and I'm on the telephone, and they'd already been talking about Michael New and what he was doing in Germany. And I came on, and I filled in with a little more details, more than they had about the story. And then the congressman announced that he wanted Michael New to come to Washington, and if he did, he was going to hold a press conference and he was going to award him a medal. And then he said, Then he stated publicly over the radio that he intended to go back to Washington and he intended to introduce legislation with some colleagues that he felt agreed with him about it to get us out of the United Nations. You might be a little bit surprised, as I have been, in this 50th anniversary year of the United Nations, how little hoopla there has been. I expected a flood of it. I expected every day to be reminded of this, and there hasn't been much, has there? They want you to think the United Nations is a bunch of bunglers. But the American people are getting the message. The Chicago Sun-Times did run this little article. U.S. soldier resists wearing UN colors. And on the very same day, in the middle of it, they had their morning line, what they call a survey, I guess. And they asked people to register an opinion on this. Should U.S. soldiers wear United Nations berets or insignia? Yes, call this number. No, call this number. And a couple of days later, they published the results. Yes, 17%, no, 83%. The alternative media is working. And what we want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to keep it responsible, keep it accurate, spread it, help it in any way we can. And the way to keep it responsible and accurate is for it to take its lead from the John Birch Society. Now that congressman, we had quite a discussion on that show, and before I got off, I had the microphone, so I figured, well, I'm going to jump in here with something else. And I said, you know, Mr. Congressman, I said, the Republican Party has stated that they can balance the budget in 7 years. And he agreed. Yes, he said, that's right. I said, and the Democrats say they can do it in 10 years. Yes, he said, that's right, too. And I said, the John Birch Society says it can be done in a matter of months. And he said, well, how? How would you do that? And I said, well, 2 very simple steps. I said, anybody can understand it. All right? The first is stop all foreign aid tomorrow. Right. It's unconstitutional. And it's not just the foreign aid appropriation, it's all foreign aid, all different kinds of it, that adds up to 2 and 3 times the amount of the foreign aid appropriation. I said, and the second step is just as easy to understand, and it's called bring the troops home. Bring them home from Korea and Japan and Germany and Italy and the Middle East and wherever they are, and stop accepting the defense budget for other nations. I said, that will get us out of these foreign entanglements. That will bring our troops. You closed the wrong bases, Mr. Congressman. I said, you closed the wrong bases. You should have closed the ones overseas and kept the ones open in the United States. Now, as surprising as it may seem, ladies and gentlemen, if those 2 steps were accomplished, honestly, that would cover the deficit for 1995. So the congressman said, you know, he says, that's really, I'm going to have to look into this. I said, good. I said, you get in touch with me if you need some more data on it. So these are the kinds of things. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations dominates the thinking of the American people. Now, let me tell you how it works. You write to them and you say to them, look, why are you doing this and this? And they'll write back and they'll say, we don't take a position on anything. What are you talking about? We welcome all kinds of views. We're just a debating society. We're a think tank. We're this, we're that. We don't have any positions. But yes, indeed, they do. And it's a very clever way that they operate. The way they do it is they set parameters on an issue, and you can argue that issue within the parameters that they set. And if you step outside those parameters, you're an ultra-extremist wacko bircher. Right? Now, let me give you some examples here, quickly. A couple of years ago, there was a classic. Should we take some foreign aid away from Egypt and Israel and give it to Poland and Hungary and the emerging new democracies in Europe? Now, you could argue either side of that. And you could even be contentious with your adversary within those parameters. But is there another alternative not discussed? Right? How about no foreign aid to anybody? It's totally unconstitutional. Well, if you say that, then you're a wacko. Right? So do they control the thinking of the American people? How about this one here? Should Poland be given a seat in NATO? Well, you can argue yes. Poland should be given a seat in NATO. You could say, no, it would offend the Russians, and we don't want to do that. It's too soon to do it. And you could argue either side of that. And you've seen, if you read Foreign Affairs magazine, as I do, you see both of those arguments. Isn't there another alternative? Yeah, how about let Poland have our seat?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's going the way they're controlling the thinking of the American people.
They do it in the electoral business too, don't they? You get a combination of a Democrat running and a Republican running. If you have an independent or a third party, our vaunted two-party system, it's as if it came down from heaven on stones like the Ten Commandments, that we got to have the two-party system, right? People ask me on radio all the time, do you think we need a third party? I said, no, we need a second. Right? And it's the same kind of thing. That's how it works. That's how they control the thinking of the American people. Don't allow it. Start being an independent thinker. Start thinking, what's the missing alternative, right? Remember, better red than dead? Better red than dead. Okay, we can be communists or we can be incinerated. Oh, gee, what a choice. Where's the missing alternative? Victory. Victory. Right? Fight for your beliefs. Be willing to put your life on the line, and if you do, you'll triumph. And stop helping the enemy. So on and on it goes. Well, anyhow, let's move on. Now, in my book, we get into discussing the Constitution. And what about the Constitution? What does it say about the war powers? What does it say about the military? Well, very quickly, it says Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So you can have an army, but you can't fund it for more than 2 years. Right after that, it says Congress shall have power to provide and maintain a Navy. No conditions. Right? What's going on here? Why is the Navy so much higher regarded than the Army? Right? And the answer is very simple. Founding fathers had a very, very distinct fear of standing armies. They knew throughout the course of history that evil rulers had gained control of armies within nations and used them against the people. And even the Declaration of Independence called as one of the complaints against King George, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. See? They had that fear of standing armies. And isn't it interesting that we're here tonight in the King George III room? You ever meet somebody from England, I have a wisecrack for you. You can look at them and you can say, you know, it's terrible what you people are doing to our language. Ooh. That goes over real big. All right, so it says you can have an army, but you can't fund it for more than 2 years, and you must have a Navy. They were afraid of standing armies. What about the Navy? Are they afraid of that? No, the Navy's purpose was clear: defend the borders against foreign marauders. And you don't have to worry about a Navy muscling amongst the people, because it's a little hard to get a battleship up to Dallas. Right? Because this was, of course, before the Naval Air Force, which makes it a little bit different. But anyhow, the point was made. Now, what else did it say? It says that Congress shall have power to declare war. Congress and Congress alone the power to declare war. Did we declare war in Korea? Vietnam? Desert Storm? What's going on here? Right? Haven't they sworn an oath to this Constitution? Well, the fact that they're allowed to go ahead and do what they're doing is, first of all, the fault of Congress, but ultimately our fault for allowing wimpy congressmen to go down there and submit. Congress and Congress alone has the power to declare war. All right, we see here now Congress has the power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To govern and regulate the land and naval forces is Congress's authority, not the President's. President Clinton has issued Presidential Decision Directive 25. And that has been classified secret, but they've issued a summary of it, and the summary is horrible. It's how the military is to conduct itself, And when, in a case-by-case basis, we can turn over the military to the United Nations. It actually says that there. And that's the summary. You can imagine what the original document is. Nobody in Congress has even seen it. And yet the military is functioning under it. But that's not the president's prerogative. The Constitution says that Congress shall make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. All right, one more thing about the Constitution. It says the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. The Army and Navy of the United States. Not the Army and Navy of the United Nations. Not to put the Army and the Navy under the United Nations. The Constitution, if you want to understand it, you go back to the intent of the lawgiver, and that's a principle of law that holds in any law. You go back to the intent of the lawgiver, or why bother writing it down? So what did the founders say about the commander-in-chief role? They said that it is an occasional assignment of responsibility, not a grant of power. What a distinction. The military is not the president's plaything. It's not his toy. It's not his to use in any endeavor he wants. And the Pentagon is now putting out press releases about young Michael New in Germany. And they're referring to the commander-in-chief role and saying that he has the authority to do what he wants with the military. Totally wrong. Has to be challenged. But happily there are so many now people who are willing to challenge. And young Michael New is already a hero. He's the kind of American that would have signed that Declaration of Independence instead of waiting to see how things worked out. Paul Revere went out through every Middlesex village and farm and said, "The British are coming, the British are coming. How many do you think responded?" People said, "Please, I'm trying to get my sleep." You were making a lot of noise. But a few did respond, didn't they? And they beat the British at the Concord Bridge and chased them all the way back to Boston. And then a lot of people joined in. When the colonists started to win, then forces were augmented, and hasn't that always been the case, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, a little history then. How did we get into the situation we're in here with this United Nations? Let's go back. We go back to 1919. And we see that the U.S. Senate is asked to ratify our entry into the League of Nations proposed by a socialist, communist cabal within the Wilson administration. And the Senate debated the matter for 9 months and said no. So at the end of World War II, the Senate is asked to debate the matter of our entry into the United Nations, and they debated the matter for 6 days and said yes. And during the debate, those 6 days, there was a senator from Montana named Burton Wheeler who stood up in the United States Senate and he said, "If we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress and the president can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere." How's that for forecasting the future? And then he voted for entry into the United Nations. They went to him and they said, "Why?" And he said, "I'll take my stand when they come and ask for troops." He never got the chance to take that stand. The sentiment for entry into the United Nations in 1945 was immense. If you're as old as I am or older, you may remember. Everybody in America was touched in some way by the war, their family, their neighbors, their cousins, whatever. And people were sick of it. Anything, we got to try something different, we got to do this. And that's the way it was sold. And no senator, or hardly any senator, would stand up against that. The vote in the Senate was 89 to 2. Just 2. Shipstead of Minnesota and Langer of North Dakota, someday we'll put up a monument to them. I've got statements from each in my book. Good reading today. Men with good foresight. So we got in the UN, July of 45. The treaty, the charter had been brought back from San Francisco where the founding meeting was held by Alger Hiss, who was later found to be a communist and was the Secretary General of the founding conference of the UN. Well, then in December of 1945, Congress was asked to pass the United Nations Participation Act. And this act empowered the President to commit troops to UN duty at his discretion. And Wheeler stood up and opposed it, the senator from Montana. He got 8 others. They only had 9 that said no. The thing was overwhelmingly passed. And the President from that day had legal authority, not really constitutional, but they passed a law and nobody really challenged it sufficiently. So he had legal authority to send troops to the United Nations at the United Nations call. Well, the next step in the progression was the creation of NATO in 1949, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who had voted for our entry into the UN, was now regretting it and stated publicly, the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone. So he stood up and he opposed NATO. He said, this commits us to get involved in a war if any one of 12 nations that we're entangled with is involved in a war. It requires us to arm all these nations, and that's liable to get us in trouble with their neighbors. And so he protested, and he was only able to get 12 other senators to back him, and 13 wasn't enough to stop it. And we entered NATO. President Truman began sending troops to Europe under NATO, which is a regional organization under the authority of the Charter, Articles 52, 3, and 4. Senator Taft said at this point that the Truman administration had adopted a tendency to interfere in the affairs of other nations, to assume that we are some kind of demigod or Santa Claus to solve the problems of the world, and that attitude is more and more likely to involve us in disputes where our liberty is not in fact concerned. Well, see, there were people who saw this and understood it, but there weren't enough of them, and there wasn't any John Birch Society to help the people to understand. What he's saying, in effect, is that the United States has now become 911 for the world. Right? The UN's global cop. Well, the next step then was the Korean War. If we go back to the presidential grant of power to be the commander-in-chief, we have to incorporate that in proper powers to send troops to repel a sudden attack without a declaration of war. That makes sense. And the president also has power to use troops to rescue Americans who might get caught up in a war breaking out somewhere, and that's what happened in Korea. The North Korean communists invaded South Korea in June of 1950. There were 2,000 Americans in South Korea. He sent the troops to rescue them, but then he assigned them to the United Nations. And Robert Taft stood up again. And he said, if this incident is allowed to go by without protest, at least from this body, we will have forever canceled the prerogative of the United States Congress to declare war. I don't think forever, but certainly there it was. We can get it back if we will. And then he said this, if we can intervene, if the president can intervene in Korea without congressional approval, he can go to war in Malaya or Indonesia or Iran or South America. And he could have said Vietnam too, couldn't he? Except there was no Vietnam at the time. The nation hadn't even been created. But there it was. And so we sent our troops there, and General MacArthur, whom I revere as one of the greatest military minds in all history, not just our nation, in all history. Even General MacArthur was buffaloed by this. He sent to the United Nations and asked them to send 400 flags to fly over the troops in Korea. And he learned to regret that. The war had been won. General MacArthur with the Incheon landing, the war was won. The North Koreans were defeated completely. And not only South Korea was liberated, but North Korea, all of it. And then the Chinese communists came across in great numbers. And MacArthur protested the restrictions that were put on him, and President Truman removed him from his command. And General MacArthur, in his own book, Reminiscences, later pointed out that the Chinese general Lin Piao later circulated a leaflet in China which stated, listen to this, the Chinese general said, I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur. And Washington did restrain General MacArthur. But who told the Chinese general that Washington would restrain MacArthur? The United Nations. The peace organization. And so there we are. By 1950, all of the steps had been taken to get us into the soup that we're into today. Vietnam was next. We sent men to fight and not to win. We told them to shoot but not to let a shot at. We told them not to chase the enemy across the borders. We supplied both sides all during the war. It was an incredible performance under SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, exactly the same as NATO, another UN regional organization. We lost 50,000 good Americans in Korea. We lost another 50,000 more in Vietnam. Terrible, terrible carnage. Neither war declared, neither war won, and we're still in that same syndrome. So let's bring it up to date now. We get up into the 1990s and we see what happens. Well, it was in the summer of 1990 that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George Bush went bonkers. Right? Kuwait, Saddam Hussein had a half-legitimate claim on Kuwait. He said it was the 19th province of his country, that the Sabah family had stolen it. And so we went there to defend the tyrannical Sabah family. Incredible. George Bush sent 500,000 men under arms. Then he went to the United Nations. That's key. And he asked the United Nations for authorization to conduct a war. They gave him the authorization. He thumbed his nose at the Congress of the United States, and Congress allowed it. And then with that authorization, he sent another 250,000. We now had 500,000 men under arms in Vietnam preparing for war. Excuse me, in Saudi Arabia, preparing for war against Iraq. The war actually broke out on January 17th of 1991. About a month before that, 2 senators went over to visit the troops in Saudi Arabia, inspection tour. Senator Mitchell of Maine and Simon of Illinois, neither of whom ever made a vote in the Senate, I agree with. But irrespective of that, they came back and they went straight to the White House to see the president, and they asked Mr. Bush not to start the war. And Senator Simon wrote the whole story in the Congressional Record. They said, Mr. President, we have reason to believe that there's going to be a bloodbath in the desert. Everybody had been told that Saddam Hussein's army was a magnificent force. There was going to be blood, boatloads of body bags, and so on. And they begged him not to start the war. They said, extend the sanctions or more negotiation or anything to avoid that bloodshed. And the president listened to them, and then finally he said to them, let me give you this one final message, said President Bush. If we use the military, we can build the United Nations. That's what he said. And that's what Desert Storm was all about. And he should have been impeached on the spot. There were 3 winners in Desert Storm. The first and most important was the United Nations. Because George Bush had said over and over again, New World Order, New World Order, New World Order, and every time he said it, he said increase the power of the United Nations, enhance it, reinvigorate it, do whatever you can. And he demonstrated that that is exactly what his goal was, and it succeeded. The second winner was Saddam Hussein, who became more powerful by the end of the war than he was when he started, because we allowed him in the confusion and everything to destroy his internal adversaries, the Shiites in the south, the Kurds in the north. And he's more powerful today in his country than he was when it started. And the third winner was Colin Powell of the Council on Foreign Relations. The man who became a presidential candidate without taking a position on anything. Now you got to ask yourself how that can happen. And then you go to the Council on Foreign Relations and you find out the leadership of Time and Newsweek and NBC and ABC and CBS, and all of them are CFR members promoting one of their own. Well, we finally found out some of his positions, didn't we? Right? Colin Powell is pro-gun control, pro-abortion, pro-affirmative action, and he thinks that one of the worst problems in America is the distribution of wealth. And they call him a conservative. I want out of that boat. The John Birch Society is very close to announcing publicly that we don't want to be called conservatives anymore. We prefer constitutionalists, right? You see, the term conservative isn't defined, isn't it? I heard Henry Kissinger recently say he was a conservative. He's the man who said that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which isn't free trade at all, of course, he said NAFTA represents the greatest step toward a new world order since the end of the Cold War. What more do you need to know about NAFTA? Right? If he's a conservative, I want out of that boat. But you see, conservative isn't defined, but constitutionalist is. And I think it makes sense. Well, maybe just constitutional conservative. Right? Maybe that'll satisfy a lot of other people. Well, what happened after Desert Storm now? Let's rapid progression and see what we're getting in deeper and deeper and deeper into this organization that is of no consequence, they say. President Bush went to the United Nations. He gave his famous Pax Universalis speech, universal peace. And in that, he called for a new kind of activity for the United Nations to settle passions within the borders of nations and to change the nation's leader. Well, wait a minute. Let's go back to the Charter of the UN. And we see Article 2, Section 7 right here on the first page, and it says this: nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. And pro-UN people have pointed out that if that had not been in the charter, the United States Senate wouldn't have ratified it, nor would a lot of other nations. But here's President Bush saying, forget that. Now let's have the United Nations intervening within the domestic jurisdiction of nations, even changing a nation's leader. Well, the Secretary General of the UN was very pleased with that, Mr. Boutros Ghali, who is nothing more than an Egyptian bureaucrat. And so he came out with his agenda for peace shortly after Mr. Bush's speech to the UN. And he started it off by saying, the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty is past. Not as long as there's breath in my body. Right? But that's what they intend. So the new agenda for the United Nations, what did it include? Well, it included the United Nations involvement in ecological damage, disruption of family life, unchecked population growth, drug usage, poverty, disease, famine, disparity between rich and poor. This is all in the agenda for peace. Virtually anything, all within the borders of nations. So George Bush went back to the United Nations, and he saluted the Secretary General and thanked him for his new agenda, and he said, I'd like to add to it humanitarian concerns. And within a couple of months, he sent 30,000 American troops to Somalia under authorization from the United Nations in a humanitarian mission. Our military was now the Red Cross. Our military is now the United Way. Our military is everything but what it should be. And what it should be is simply a protection of the life and property of the people of the United States. That's all. They have added to that the life and the property and vital interests. And they don't define vital interests, which opens it up for anything. So now we have all these troops on a humanitarian mission in Somalia, within the borders of Somalia, and the mission turns ugly, and so the mission is changed by the United Nations with United States cooperation, and now the new mission is to disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. How's that for a precedent? Well, they finally came out of there. And then President Clinton's in office. Now President Clinton decides that he's going to send United States troops under United Nations authorization once again into Haiti. And he says Haiti is a threat to international peace and security. Well, you understand that Haiti's a threat to Haiti and nothing else, right? Nothing else. And what was the mission in Haiti? Disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. They reinserted a psychopathic killer named Aristide over those people who had booted him out of there, even though many had voted for him. And we meddled in the affairs of a sovereign nation, within the borders of the nation. And the precedent has not only been set, but it has been acted upon. Now ask yourself, could that precedent, disarming the civilian population and changing the nation's life, could it be used elsewhere by this organization that is no threat to anybody? And the answer is certainly. How about our own nation? Could we see Pakistani troops or Sudanese or Red Chinese troops coming to the United States to disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader? Right? Now, you might want the nation's leader changed today, but you don't want it done that way. Ladies and gentlemen, there we are. That's what's happening to us. The Council on Foreign Relations dominates our military. Our own people don't protest the way they're being used, except one little Spec 4 in the U.S. Army in Germany who has sent up a flare. And it's burning very brightly. Well, let's hope that there are others that join him. He said that a lot of his comrades in the military have said very much that they support what he's doing, but that they can't step out in front and they can't say what they want to say and so forth. And good luck, Michael, and I hope you succeed and that kind of thing. Now, one other thing before we begin to wind this up, and that is this famous document, Freedom from War, the U.S. Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, introduced at the UN by President John Kennedy in 1961. All right? The document is a multi-phased, three-stage program leading to all nations, including our own, turning over their military to the United Nations. Yes, let's just read the end of it here. It says, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. There's that oxymoron again. Nobody but the UN. It also says this. It says the manufacture of armaments would be prohibited except for those of agreed types and quantities to be used by the UN peace force. That's disarmament of the people. The document is called, we've republished this entire document as an appendix in my books here. The document is called the U.S. Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, and that's a lie. It's not. It's for selective disarmament. Everybody but the United Nations. And periodically, I or one of my colleagues will call down to Washington and will ask some high official of the government if this is indeed the fixed and determined policy of the government of the United States. I did so recently, and the response was, oh yes, and much of it has already been accomplished. I knew that, and I simply thanked Dr. William Nary of the Arms Control and Disarmament Administration, and I said a little prayer for my country. There we are, ladies and gentlemen. And the UN is supposed to be of no consequence. It's just a bunch of bunglers. The UN is being used by our leaders to build world government. It's not the other way around. It's not that the UN is using us. It's that the leaders of our nation, in concert with some of their confreres in other nations, are using the United Nations to build their own power over the planet. And it's got to be stopped. But I've already demonstrated to you in a couple of ways here that the American people are catching on. The sentiment for Michael New is immense. The attitude of the people in that survey in the Chicago newspaper is immense. Everywhere I go in the country, I go on talk radio, and the people who call don't disagree at all. Yes, we've got to get out of the UN. And so pro-UN forces within our country are beginning to get a little jittery about this. There's an organization called the United Nations Association for the United States, and they sent out this 4-page fundraiser. They're worried. Dear friend, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S. For almost a century now, this has been the war cry of a small but very vocal group of Americans. You know them, and so do I. They are the reactionary isolationists, the fringe right-wingers, the paranoid style in American politics. What a compliment, please. That it would come from these people. Yes, they're worried. Let's make them really worried. Huh? So we're into the UN. How do we get out? And why should we get out? Look at this headline. The UN tells peacekeepers to shoot to kill. The peace organization. There it is, Atlanta Constitution, May 12, 1995. UN tells its people, shoot to kill. What a peace organization that is. How do we get out of the United Nations? Well, how did we get in? We got in with the Senate voting, then the Senate can vote us out. I don't expect it to happen. Any other ways? Well, the president can abrogate a treaty. I remember that Jimmy Carter abrogated a treaty. We had a mutual defense treaty with the Free Chinese on Taiwan, 1979. It's over. We're recognizing Red China. Now, I don't know if that's proper or not, but he did it. So, you know, it's there. If they can act on precedent, maybe we can. But I don't expect Bill Clinton to do that. What else can be done? Well, the House of Representatives is where I think the action really is. The House of Representatives has the power of the purse. Go back to that Constitution again. It still stands, and that's why there's a drive on for a constitutional convention. That's why they want this conference of the states. They don't want this thing there. You know, you're going to wipe out the potential of the American people getting back to this. That's a very important thing to realize, and it's very important to protect this Constitution so that we can force them to abide by it. Article 1, Section 7, very simple. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. If the House of Representatives will not originate a bill to fund anything whatsoever, there's nothing the Senate, the President, the courts, or the New York Times can do about it. So the job is to get a majority in the House of Representatives to refuse to fund anything to do with the United Nations. And then a whole bunch of other things besides. There's 435 of them, 218 needed. How do we get 218 to do that? Well, you have a trim bulletin sitting on your chair, and that's how we do that. The trim bulletins. We put out trim bulletins for congressmen all over the United States. Now, you're Congressman Martin Frost here. I would have guessed he was from Massachusetts, but anyhow, look at this fella. 4 X's and 4 stars. Right? Right? Middle of the road. All right, now here's John Spratt from South Carolina. He's got all X's and 1 star. He's a CFR member. Right? That 1 star is going to get him in trouble with those guys. Well, what about some of these other people? Well, look at this, one after another here. We've got all stars from Illinois, all stars, Arizona, all stars from Wisconsin, all stars from New York. Can it be done? Sure, it can be done. And all of these fellows were reelected. All right, now, here's another one. This is an interesting one here. I've kind of blown this up a little. Here's a congressman with 2 stars and 6 X's. All right. He voted for the National Endowment for the Arts. He voted for $1.2 billion for UN peacekeeping. He voted for billions for education, billions for housing, more billions for housing, foreign aid, right? Would you consider him a conservative? No. Somebody blurted out who it was. It's Newt Gingrich. Oh, no. There's your leader of the Republican Revolution. Right? You talk about throwing a ball game. Right? Now, prior to that, Mr. Gingrich's trim bulletin, he came out and he had 3 stars and 4 X's. And one time he didn't vote. What did he vote for here? He voted for the federal government bankrolling private businesses, which is wrong. He voted for more education funds. He voted for increased funding for the IRS. And he voted for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. He and his buddy Limbaugh pushed in GATT and NAFTA, economic unions, which are always followed by political unions, which makes it very easy to create from them a world government. And that's what NAFTA and GATT are all about and nothing more. Well, ladies and gentlemen, just think of millions of these distributed in the districts throughout the United States. In 1994, there were a lot of nice results in the elections. A lot of big spenders got sent home. And different people came in there mouthing Republican and conservative views, and the results have not been too promising, have they? All the great promise seems to... Well, of course, who's to blame for that but Gingrich? He's got them working on fluff. He's got them working on some things that are absolutely counterproductive. He, for instance, would have part of his contract with America the fact that no troops should be put under UN command, but we should increase the size and power of NATO. Counting on ignorance of the American people. I was on a radio show the other day with a fellow in Denver, and I was in the studio with him, and we talked about a lot of different things, and he finally said to me before the show ended, he said, "Who's the most dangerous man in America?" And he went like that. And I said, "It has to be Newt Gingrich." And he went, "Oh." And I believe that, ladies and gentlemen. The lie that's closest to the truth is always more dangerous. Always more dangerous. So trim bulletins that are on spending matters can indeed lead to getting us out of the United Nations, getting us out of this and out of that. George Washington said, "Commercial relations with all, foreign entanglements with none." Better advice was never given to the American people. So it can be done. And trim is the way to do it. Well, I've kept you probably longer than I should have, but let's wind this up by going back, right back to where we started. We go back to that Declaration of Independence. And we find 56 men huddled in a room in Philadelphia, thinking about the fact that they're signing a document that is in fact a death warrant, their own. They know that if they're captured and caught, they will be hanged. They know that the British has the greatest army in the world at the time, and that the American forces are weak and scattered. And yet they were willing to do it. They were willing to pledge their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor. And at a very critical point there, the tremor went through the room, and John Adams stood and he gave his marvelous testimony, and he said, "Live or die, survive or perish, I am for the Declaration. It is my living sentiment, and by the blessing of God it shall be my dying sentiment. Independence now, and independence forever." And they signed. And they launched the greatest experiment in human liberty in all history, our country. 5 of them were captured by the British as traitors and tortured before being killed. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost sons in the army. Another 2 had sons captured. There was a wealthy planter from Virginia who saw his ships swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and died in rags. Another one in Delaware was hounded by the British, forced to move his family constantly. He served in the Congress without pay, kept his family in hiding, his possessions were taken from him, and he died in poverty. None of them recanted. The British put out the word and said, "If you will recant, we will forgive you with no problem." None of them did. They said that for all but 2. They would not forgive John Hancock and Sam Adams. What a credential that is. There was one man whose home was seized by the British as a headquarters, and he directed artillery fire on his own home. But it was worth it. And they launched the greatest experiment in all history for freedom. Our country, the United States of America, which is gravely threatened today. Not from a foreign adversary, though. Threatened from within, which gives us a far greater opportunity to right the wrongs and set things correctly. And that's what we have to do. If you mean to do that, you want to be effective at it. But the way to do that is the John Birch Society. It's like, if you're going to play baseball, be a major leaguer, not a minor leaguer. The John Birch Society is the leader, and it's recognized by friend and foe. We want your participation. We ask you to join our organization, put your shoulder to the wheel with us, make us more effective, more potent, so that we get our country back away from these rascals and leave it to the children of today and tomorrow.
You and I, except for maybe a few of you here in this room, are people who were born into freedom. We did absolutely nothing to deserve what we have. We were just lucky to have been born within the borders of this nation. We owe the people who gave us that freedom something, but we owe even more something to those who come after us, if not to ourselves. The children of today and tomorrow, without them realizing, they look to us and they say, help us, save this freedom so we can enjoy it. And we're back where the 56 were when they signed that declaration. That's what we're asking you to do. Reinforce that declaration of independence. Get us out of the United Nations and do it through the John Birch Society, and it'll get done a lot sooner. Robert Welsh, when he conducted meetings for many years, always ended by saying simply, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking, and that's the way I'll end. Come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking.